Be featuring 10 of the best late game champions for Season 14 that you can look to stop solo. Ridiculous stat line when it comes down to win rate based on game length is Ornn. In games that last under 30 minutes, Ornn is only winning 47% of the time, but if you're able to make it past that 30-minute mark on the champion, his win rate spikes to 53%. A big reason for this is because of Ornn's ability to upgrade items. Once Ornn hits level 13, he's able to upgrade his own item. For each level from 14 to level 17, he can then upgrade one of his teammates' items. The longer games last, the more stats Ornn is able to provide for his team, which gives his team as a whole a much greater chance of winning. On top of being able to upgrade items, there's another part to Ornn's passive to where he increases his bonus armor, bonus magic resist, and bonus health by 10% from all sources. For each item he upgrades, he then increases this amount by another 4%. This makes Ornn extremely tanky as games drag out and very difficult to kill. Ornn's team fight is also some of the best for any top lane champ, so when it comes down to that final late game fight, the champion has incredible impact. So if you want to play a top lane champion who excels at team fighting and only becomes stronger the longer games last, Ornn is the pick. Hands down, the best late game top lane champion for Season 14 is Kayle. Kayle has a very similar trajectory as Ornn when it comes to win rate based on game length, but to an even more insane degree. In games that end before 25 minutes, Kayle players are only winning 46% of the time. If you manage to scale up though and get past the 30-minute mark, Kayle's win rate skyrockets up to 56%. It gets even more disgusting the longer the game goes, as Kayle players are winning 61% of the time in games that are over 40 minutes. Kayle's passive is the driving factor for her late game dominance. When you reach level 16 with Kayle, you gain 100 bonus range on your autos. You also no longer need to stack up the Zealous passive, where you get 30% attack speed and 10% movement speed at max stacks, as you are granted those stats permanently. The strength of a well-timed Kayle ultimate in the late game is also extremely influential. Being able to negate a fed dive champion's damage completely and halt them in their tracks is a massive tool to have for the later stages of the game. Kayle also scales insanely well with items, as the brunt of her damage is going to come from auto attacks, so all that point and click damage makes Kayle's DPS output very reliable. One jungler who you may not expect to be on this list but who has an incredible track record in games that go beyond 30 minutes is Evelynn. Evelynn is one of the highest win rates for any jungler in games that last over 30 minutes, sitting at 54%. Now, unlike Kayle and Ornn, Evelynn doesn't have some sort of crazy scaling mechanic in her kit that can explain this trend. So what's the reason behind Evelynn seeing so much success later on? Well, our theory is that the stealth and ability to find catch plays is something that heavily sways solo queue games. And Evelynn in the mid to late game with Rabadon's completed can very easily one-shot squishy targets, and the fact that she can find these assassinations in such creative ways makes her late game impact very high. A lot of the time, all you gotta do is be patient with Evelynn. The enemy team will split up a bit, and then you just pop out of stealth for a free kill on the enemy squishy when the enemy team is not suspecting it. When it comes down to finding a late game catch on a squishy target, there are few champions who can execute on that more reliably than Evelynn. Evelynn also has some of the best objective securing potential for any jungler in the game due to her execute damage from R. This makes securing a late game Baron or Elder Dragon that much easier and can dictate how late game fights play out. Another jungler who becomes increasingly stronger the longer games last is Master Yi. Yi is winning over 53% of the time in games that are over 30 minutes. One element of Yi's kit that makes his late game a lot better than most champs is the true damage from his E. True damage is going to scale insanely well, since the longer games last, the more resists players are able to acquire, but true damage completely ignores those resists, which makes it a really OP stat in the later game. Since so much of Master Yi's damage is coming from his auto attacks, he's a very item-reliant champion. The 3-item core for Master Yi right now has him building Kraken Slayer, Rage Blade, and Titanic Hydra. If you're able to complete this 3-item core, the impact Yi has is incredibly high, as you've got loads of damage and some nice added durability from Titanic Hydra. With these items, you can basically just run any squishy down and auto attack them to death, which gives Yi a lot of consistent impact in the later game. These champs like Yi and Kayle, who can deal an incredible amount of consistent DPS, are always going to be high win rate late game champs, since they have the potential to output so much damage without requiring a ton of skill. The absolute god of the late game for mid lane is none other than Kassadin. In games that last over 30 minutes, Kassadin players are winning 56% of the time, which is one of the highest in the entire game. Level 16 Kassadin with a few items is one of the most unbeatable champions that you can play. The constant mobility on top of all the burst damage allows him to solo win games. Our cooldown drops to below 2 seconds at level 16, while the burst damage that Kassadin can output is so reliable. Even though Kassadin Kassadin E and R are technically skill shots, they're very easy to land, which makes his full burst combo pretty foolproof. You also have a good chunk of durability from your core items, with the health from Rod of Ages and the shield from Seraph's Embrace, so not only can you one-shot squishies, but it's hard for enemies to take you down before you just kill someone and ult right out. So as long as you have levels and items on Kassadin, the impact of the champion is ridiculously high. Just a smidge in behind Kassadin, but still an incredibly strong late game champion, is Aurelion Sol. It's absolutely wild how much of a free win Aurelion Sol becomes the longer that games drag out, as he's winning over 55% of the time in games that are 30 minutes or longer. Now with this in mind, Aurelion Sol's win rate in games that last under 25 minutes is only 45%, so a 10% spread there is super wild. The big reason for this is because of Aurelion Sol's passive. The more passive stacks you're able to acquire, the stronger the champion becomes, so you need to be able to ramp up with Sol to make the greatest impact. It also helps that Aurelion Sol's main source of damage coming from his Q is a very easy ability to use, so it's just guaranteed insane damage once you get a few items and have those passive stacks. Games that last longer than 30 minutes often come down to that one big team fight, and a well-timed Aurelion Sol ultimate followed up with his E has such incredible AoE damage and zone control. If the enemy team groups up in a choke point, there are few champions who have as much influence in those situations than Aurelion Sol. The newest champion in League of Legends is one of the most broken late game champs we've ever seen, and cracking the top 10 is Smolder. As long as you can get the game past 25 minutes, Smolder has an absolutely absurd win rate right now. It's just those games that are under 25 minutes to where Smolder struggles a bit more, which is an understandable trade-off. Where it really becomes nuts is if you can reach 30 minutes plus, as Smolder players are winning upwards of 55%. So what makes Smolder such a monstrous late game pick? Well, it's mainly tied to how his passive works. Whenever Smolder hits an enemy with an ability, or whenever his Q kills a minion or a monster, he gains Dragon Practice stacks. These Dragon Practice stacks then increase the power of Smolder's abilities. At 225 stacks is where Smolder really comes online, as he gains bonus max health true damage on his Q. There's also an execute on Smolder's Q that scales with Dragon Practice stacks as well. So the more Dragon Practice stacks you're able to get, the more true damage you have, and the greater the threshold is on the execute, which makes Smolder a late game god. One of the best late game champions for years now, and still in the top 10 for Season 14, is Vayne. Although not as crazy as Smolder, Vayne is in that top percentile win rate wise in games that last over 30 minutes, as she's winning 53% of the time. With Vayne, there are a few factors that give her the edge up on most ADCs when it comes down to later game situations. The first is that Vayne is a more self-sufficient ADC, in the sense that she has ways to peel off dive champions with her Condemn from E, and then can kite away with the mobility from Q. As you reach the later stages of the game on ADC, everyone is going to be hard focusing you in fights, so having the self-peel that Vayne possesses gives her more reliable late game impact. Of course, the true damage coming out of Vayne's W is another big factor to her late game dominance. There are few ADCs who can chew through tanks better than Vayne. So many ADCs can feel absolutely useless if the enemy comp stacks resists, but with Vayne, that's really never an issue. One of the most insane stat lines you'll ever see for a champion when comparing early game versus late game success belongs to Yuumi. If you're not able to get the game past 25 minutes with Yuumi, her win rate is currently sitting at 42%. For every 5 minutes that passes though, Yuumi's win rate rises drastically as it spikes up to 53% in games that are over 30 minutes. So basically, Yuumi is the definition of a coin flip champion. The early game impact of Yuumi is non-existent, and you are just praying that your team can hold on for long enough so that you can do something. You don't really have the ability to make plays on your own, so you're solely reliant on your teammates to complete their items, and at that point, buffing them up is where Yuumi can become oppressive. In games that are over 30 minutes, chances are someone on your team has enough items for them to carry the game, and having a Yuumi being able to buff them up can be very strong. So rounding out the top 10, and one of the best scaling supports in the game, is Senna. Senna doesn't have as bad of an early game win rate as someone like Yuumi, as she wins in around 49% of games that are less than 25 minutes. Senna does, however, have as good of a late game win rate as Yuumi, with it being around 53% in games that are over 30 minutes. With Senna, it all stems from her passive, to where she gains bonus AD, range, and crit chance for collecting mist wraiths. Mist wraiths will continue to spawn throughout the entirety of the game, so this just means the longer games last, the more stats Senna will acquire, and the more unbeatable she'll become. The range in which you can play at while dealing an incredible amount of damage makes Senna one of the safer and strongest ranged characters.